The engine hummed steadily beneath me, the only companion I had on this empty stretch of Nevada highway. The radio crackled faintly, failing to pick up anything but static and the occasional whisper of a distant AM station. The world outside the windshield was a vast, barren landscape, where the endless desert seemed to merge seamlessly with the starless sky. It was the kind of night that felt heavy, thick with an unspoken stillness that pressed against the car windows, muting even the roar of the tires against the asphalt. I hadn't seen another car in over an hour, and the isolation, once so liberating, had begun to feel oppressive. The clock on the dashboard read 9:45 p.m., its glowing numbers a stark reminder of how late it was getting. I was on my way to California, making the long drive to visit family for the first time in years. After months of isolation thanks to the pandemic, I craved some semblance of normalcy, even if it meant enduring the grueling trek across Nevada's desolate highways. My car was packed with snacks, water bottles, and a suitcase crammed with more clothes than I'd ever need. Yet, for all my planning, I hadn't accounted for the exhaustion that was now creeping in. The gas gauge dipped precariously close to the red zone, and my stomach growled in protest. I'd been so focused on making good time that I hadn't stopped for food or fuel since noon. When the faint glow of a roadside sign appeared in the distance, relief washed over me like, Banda NOI, Ue Bambai Sauve, ChatGPT da NOI, ChatGPT, Exine Loine, Twasi Teep Tuc Viet Dung Fan 1 Voy NOI Dung Dai Han, Chi Teet Honda Dapung Yu Ka Kwa Ban, De La Fan Mo Dao Mo Rong Cho Ka Chuyen, The Forgotten Rest Stop, Kawang 1702. Fan 1. The Lonely Road. The hum of the engine echoed through the still night, a steady drone that served as my only comfort on the vast, empty highway. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly on either side, an expanse of shadowed nothingness illuminated only by the dim glow of my headlights. Above me, the stars were obscured by a thick veil of clouds, and the darkness felt as though it were pressing down on me, suffocating in its weight. It was supposed to be an easy trip, just me, my car, and the road, heading west to visit my family for the first time in years. With the world still reeling from the chaos of the pandemic, this drive was meant to be a sort of escape, a chance to reconnect, to breathe in something other than the stale air of my apartment. But somewhere along the way, the open road had lost its charm. The silence had turned oppressive, and the thrill of solitude had been replaced by an aching loneliness. The clock on the dashboard read 9:45 p.m., its faint glow the only light inside the car. I hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour, and the vastness of the desert began to feel less like freedom and more like a prison. My gas gauge was dangerously close to empty, the needle hovering just above the red. I cursed myself for not stopping earlier, but I'd been so eager to make good time that I'd ignored every chance to refuel. Now, with my stomach growling and my eyelids heavy, I had no choice but to find a place to stop. That's when I saw it, a faint, flickering glow in the distance. At first, I thought it might be a mirage, a cruel trick played by my tired mind. But as I drew closer, the glow sharpened into the unmistakable shape of a neon sign, its light casting eerie shadows onto the cracked asphalt. The sign read, Rest Stop, open 24 hours, the letters buzzing faintly as if struggling to stay lit. Beneath it, a rusted arrow pointed down a narrow dirt road that veered off the highway. Against my better judgment, I turned onto the dirt road, the tires kicking up clouds of dust as I followed the arrow. The road was uneven and overgrown with weeds, and for a moment, I considered turning back. But the prospect of gas, food, and even a brief stretch of my legs was too tempting to resist. After what felt like an eternity, the road opened up to a small clearing, and there it was, the rest stop. It was a relic of a bygone era, the kind of place that might have thrived in the 70s but had long since fallen into disrepair. A row of gas pumps stood at the edge of the clearing, their paint peeling and their hoses coiled like dead snakes. Beyond them, a single building sat hunched against the darkness, its facade faded and cracked. A dim light spilled out from the windows, casting long shadows across the empty parking lot. I pulled up to one of the pumps and killed the engine, the sudden silence ringing in my ears. The air was still and heavy, carrying with it the faint scent of dust and oil. There were no other cars in sight, no sign of life save for the faint hum of the neon sign overhead. I hesitated, my hand resting on the door handle. Something about this place felt off, but the needle on my gas gauge left me little choice. Stepping out of the car, I was struck by how quiet it was. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the unsettling kind. The kind that made you feel like you were being watched. The gravel crunched under my boots as I made my way toward the building. Inside, I could see shelves lined with snacks and drinks, their packaging faded and dusty. A single figure stood behind the counter, their face obscured by the glare of the fluorescent lights. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and a bell chimed faintly overhead. The air inside was stale, carrying a faint metallic tang that set my teeth on edge. The figure behind the counter looked up, their eyes meeting mine with a sharpness that made me pause. It was an older man, his face weathered and lined like the desert outside. He wore a threadbare flannel shirt and a name tag that simply read Bill. "Evenin'," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "You just passing through?" I nodded, trying to shake the unease that was creeping up my spine. "Yeah, just needed some gas. You take cards?" He gestured toward the counter, where an old credit card machine sat blinking faintly. "Pump self-serve. Pay after." "Thanks," I said, turning to leave. "Hold on," he called after me, his tone sharp. I turned back, and for a moment, he just stared at me, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You shouldn't stick around here too long. Just get what you need and go." The words sent a chill down my spine, but I forced a smile and nodded. "Got it." Outside, the air felt even heavier than before, the silence pressing against my ears like cotton. I filled up the tank as quickly as I could, my eyes darting toward the shadows at the edge of the clearing. The desert stretched out endlessly beyond the faint glow of the rest stop, a vast and unknowable darkness that seemed to swallow everything whole. As I replaced the nozzle, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. My head snapped toward the source, but there was nothing there. Just the empty parking lot and the dimly lit building. I shook my head, chalking it up to exhaustion and nerves. Sliding back into the driver's seat, I turned the key in the ignition and the engine roared to life. The glow of the dashboard felt comforting, a small bubble of light in the oppressive darkness. As I pulled back onto the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The rest stop grew smaller and smaller, its neon sign flickering faintly in the distance. But just as I was about to merge back onto the highway, a strange sensation washed over me, a sudden, inexplicable sense of déjà vu. I glanced down at the dashboard, and my heart skipped a beat. The clock read 9:45 p.m. That couldn't be right. I'd spent at least 15 minutes at the rest stop, filling up the tank, talking to the cashier. I tapped the clock, thinking it might be broken, but the numbers didn't budge. The unease I'd been trying to suppress began to bubble up again, more insistent this time. Shaking my head, I tried to push the thought away and focus on the road ahead. But as the minutes passed, that sense of wrongness only grew stronger. The landscape outside the window seemed off. The desert looked the same as it had before, but something about it felt different, like I was seeing a distorted reflection of the world I knew. And then I saw it, the faint, flickering glow of a neon sign in the distance. The faint flickering glow of the neon sign pierced the darkness again, casting its eerie light across the cracked asphalt. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles turning white as I stared ahead in disbelief. It was impossible. I had just left that rest stop. My foot instinctively eased off the gas, the car slowing to a crawl as I tried to process what I was seeing. "No," I muttered under my breath. "No way." The sign read the same, rest stop, open 24 hours, its buzzing neon light sputtering faintly like it was struggling to stay alive. Beneath it, the same rusted arrow pointed down the same dirt road. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard again, 9:45 p.m. It hadn't changed. My pulse quickened, a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. For a brief moment, I considered just driving past it, ignoring the absurdity of the situation. But something stopped me, a gnawing sense of curiosity, Or maybe just the desperate need to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. With a heavy sigh, I turned the wheel and pulled onto the dirt road once more. The tires crunched against the gravel as I approached the clearing, and there it was. The same row of gas pumps, the same rundown building, the same flickering light spilling out from the windows. My heart was pounding now, each beat echoing in my ears like a drum. I parked in the same spot, killed the engine, and stepped out into the oppressive silence. This time, the stillness felt heavier, almost alive. The air was thick and suffocating, carrying with it the faint, metallic tang I'd noticed earlier. I made my way toward the building, each step feeling heavier than the last. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and the faint chime of the bell overhead sent a chill down my spine. Inside, nothing had changed. The shelves were still lined with dusty snacks and drinks. The fluorescent lights still buzzed faintly overhead, and there behind the counter stood the same man, Bill. His weathered face lit up with recognition as he looked at me, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly. "Well, you're back quick," he said, his tone more bemused than surprised. "Forget something?" I stared at him, my mouth opening and closing as I struggled to find the words. I just left," I stammered. "I was driving for at least 15 minutes, and then I ended up back here." His expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that looked uncomfortably close to pity. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the counter as he fixed me with a steady gaze. "You're not the first, you know," he said quietly. My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached beneath the counter and pulled out a photograph, sliding it across the counter toward me. I hesitated before picking it up, my fingers trembling slightly. The photo was old, the edges yellowed and curling with age. It showed a small group of people standing in front of the rest stop, 3 men and 2 women, all smiling awkwardly at the camera. I didn't recognize any of them, but there was something unsettling about the photo, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. "Who are they?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "They're the ones who came before you," Bill said. "They all stopped here, just like you. And they all ended up staying longer than they planned." I felt a chill run down my spine. What happened to them? He didn't answer. Instead, he just nodded toward the door. "You should leave," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And don't come back." I wanted to press him for more, to demand answers, but the look in his eyes stopped me. There was a weight to his gaze, a silent warning that sent a shiver through me. Without another word, I turned and left, the bell chiming faintly as the door swung shut behind me. Outside, the air felt colder, sharper. I climbed back into my car, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I pulled back onto the dirt road, the gravel crunching beneath the tires. As I approached the highway, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, or someone, watching me from the clearing. But there was nothing, just the faint glow of the neon sign growing smaller and smaller in the distance. I merged back onto the highway, my heart pounding as I forced myself to focus on the road ahead. But no matter how far I drove, the feeling of unease wouldn't leave me. The desert stretched out endlessly on either side, the darkness swallowing everything beyond the faint beam of my headlights. I checked the clock again, 9:45 p.m. The thought hit me like a punch to the gut. Was I still stuck in some kind of loop? I glanced out the window, my eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of change, but it was all the same. Endless desert, endless darkness. And then, in the distance, I saw it again. The glow of the neon sign. The neon glow appeared in the distance again, like a beacon of inevitability, taunting me. My hands clenched the steering wheel, my knuckles pale against the darkness surrounding me. I couldn't believe it. I had been driving for miles, but here it was again. The same dirt road, the same rusted arrow, the same curse sign flickering, "Rest Stop, open 24 hours. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "No, no, no." The car screeched to a halt, my heart racing as I stared at the sign. It wasn't possible. I had taken no turns, no detours. The highway had been a straight line. My chest tightened with panic as I reached for my phone. No signal. The bar in the corner of the screen sat lifeless, mocking me with its emptiness. I flipped through the settings, desperate for any connection, but it was futile. In frustration, I slammed the phone down on the passenger seat and tried to think. What was happening? Was I losing my mind? Was this some kind of dream? Taking a deep breath, I told myself I needed to stay rational. There had to be an explanation. Maybe I had missed a turn without realizing it, or maybe the highway looped around somehow. Either way, I couldn't just sit here. I had to keep moving. This time, I resolved not to stop, no matter what. I pressed down on the accelerator, the engine roaring as I sped past the dirt road without even glancing at it. The neon glow faded behind me, swallowed by the night, and for a moment, I felt a glimmer of relief. I'd broken free. I just needed to keep going, to stay on the road, and everything would be fine. But as the miles ticked by, that relief began to fade. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, the same cracked asphalt disappearing into the horizon. The desert on either side seemed eerily still, the shadows cast by my headlights unmoving, unnatural. The sense of unease grew with each passing mile, and soon I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I checked the clock on the dashboard, 9:45 p.m. My stomach churned. It hadn't moved. No, I muttered, shaking my head. That's not possible. The clock had been stuck at 9:45 since I left the rest stop. I grabbed my phone again, hoping its clock would tell a different story, but the screen lit up to reveal the same time. 9:45 p.m. The numbers glared back at me, unchanging, as if they were mocking me. Okay, I said aloud, my voice trembling. Stay calm. Just keep driving. I focused on the road, forcing myself to ignore the clock and the creeping dread clawing at the edges of my mind. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something, a flicker of movement in the rearview mirror. I glanced up, my heart skipping a beat. At first, I saw nothing, just the empty stretch of highway behind me. But then it appeared again, a shadow, darting across the road far in the distance. It was quick, barely more than a blur, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. What the hell? I slowed the car, squinting into the rearview mirror as I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. But the road behind me remained empty, the darkness unbroken. Shaking my head, I pressed down on the accelerator again, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then I saw it again. This time, it wasn't in the mirror. It was in front of me. Something moved at the edge of the headlight's beam, a fleeting shadow that disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. My heart pounded as I scanned the road ahead, my grip on the steering wheel tightening. There was nothing there, just the endless stretch of highway and the desert beyond. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I drove for what felt like hours, the tension in my chest growing with each passing moment. The clock still hadn't moved, and the road showed no signs of changing. It was as if I were stuck in some kind of limbo, trapped in an endless loop with no way out. And then, just as I was starting to feel the edges of panic creep in, I saw it. The neon glow. No, I whispered, my voice shaking. No, not again. But there it was, the rest stop, exactly as I'd left it. The dirt road stretched out invitingly, the flickering sign casting its pale light across the desert. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel, my mind racing. I couldn't go back there. I couldn't. But what choice did I have? The highway had brought me back here, and I had no idea how to escape. My phone was useless. The clock refused to move, and the shadows, whatever they were getting closer. Taking a deep breath, I turned onto the dirt road once more. The rest stop looked even more desolate than before. The rows of gas pumps sat under the dim light, their metal surfaces covered in rust and grime. The air was thick with the same metallic tang, and the oppressive silence seemed to press down on me like a physical weight. I parked the car and stepped out, my movements slow and deliberate. The gravel crunched beneath my feet as I made my way toward the building, my eyes scanning the darkness for any signs of movement. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and the faint chime of the bell sent a shiver down my spine. Bill was still there, standing behind the counter as if he hadn't moved since I last saw him. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. "You're back," he said finally, his voice calm and steady. "Figured you would be." I stared at him, my mind racing. What the hell is going on? I demanded. Why can't I leave? Why does the road keep bringing me back here? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached under the counter and pulled out the same photograph he'd shown me earlier. Sliding it across the counter, he gestured for me to take another look. This time, I noticed something I hadn't before. In the background of the photo, partially obscured by the group of people, was the faint outline of a car. My car. My blood ran cold. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why is my car in this picture?" Bill's expression didn't change. "You've been here before," he said simply. "You just don't remember." My head spun as his words sank in. I shook my head, refusing to believe it. "No," I said firmly. "I've never been here before tonight. I would remember." "Would you?" he asked, his tone gentle but unyielding. "Think about it. How long have you been driving? How many times have you looked at that clock?" I glanced at the clock on the wall behind him, 9:45 p.m. The same as before. The same as always. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling. This isn't possible." Bill sighed, his expression softening. "It's not about what's possible," he said. "It's about what is." Bill's words echoed in my head like a haunting refrain. "You've been here before." I wanted to argue, to shout, to demand answers, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. There was something eerily familiar about this place, as if it were etched into the corners of my mind, hidden beneath layers of forgotten memories. But how? Why? I stared at the photograph again, my car clearly visible in the background, its distinct bumper sticker unmistakable. It didn't make sense. My car was only a few years old. How could it have been in a photo that looked decades old? "Tell me what's going on," I said, my voice a mix of anger and desperation. "I deserve to know." Bill leaned on the counter, his eyes steady as he studied me. "It's not about what you deserve," he said finally. "It's about what you can handle." "I can handle it," I snapped. "Just tell me." For a long moment, he said nothing, the air between us heavy with tension. Then, with a resigned sigh, he began to speak. "This place," he said, gesturing to the rest stop around us, "it's not just a pit stop on the side of the road. It's a crossing point, a threshold. People come here when they're lost, sometimes on the road, sometimes in life." I frowned, not understanding. "What does that mean? A crossing point to where?" He didn't answer directly. Instead, he pointed to the clock on the wall. "That clock hasn't moved in years," he said. "Time doesn't work here the way it does out there. For some people, this place is a way station. For others, it's a trap." His words sent a chill down my spine. "A trap?" I echoed. "What do you mean? Who's trapping people?" He hesitated, as if weighing how much to tell me. "Let's just say, there are rules to this place. Rules you've already broken." My heart pounded. "What rules?" I didn't see any rules. How was I supposed to know? Bill's gaze hardened. "Ignorance doesn't absolve you," he said. "The moment you stepped off the highway and onto this dirt road, you entered into something you don't understand. And now, it's not so easy to leave." I shook my head, backing away from the counter. "No," I said, my voice rising. "That's not fair. I didn't choose this. I didn't." "You did," he interrupted, his tone sharp. "Maybe not consciously, but you did. Everyone who comes here does." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to deny it, to reject the idea that I had somehow brought this on myself. But deep down, a part of me knew he was right. There was a reason I had taken that exit, a reason I had ignored the unease in my gut and stopped at this rest stop. I just didn't know what it was yet. The weight of his words hung over me as I left the store and stepped back outside. The air was colder now, the night darker than before. The neon sign flickered faintly, casting distorted shadows across the empty parking lot. I got back into my car, gripping the steering wheel tightly as I stared at the road ahead. My mind was a whirlwind of questions and fears, but one thought rose above the rest. I have to get out of here. Taking a deep breath, I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot. The headlights cut through the darkness as I drove back onto the highway, the familiar stretch of asphalt stretching out before me. But no matter how far I drove, no matter how fast I went, the same sense of déjà vu settled over me like a heavy fog. And then I saw it again. The neon glow. The rest stop. My stomach dropped as I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt in the middle of the road. I stared at the flickering sign in disbelief, my mind racing. This couldn't be happening. It wasn't possible. I checked the clock on the dashboard, 9:45 p.m. I slammed my fists against the steering wheel, a scream of frustration ripping from my throat. Why? I shouted, my voice echoing into the emptiness around me. Why can't I leave? As if in response, a new sound broke through the silence, the low rumble of an engine. My heart leapt as I turned to look in the rearview mirror, hoping to see another car, another person who could help me make sense of this nightmare. But what I saw instead froze the blood in my veins. It was my car, or rather, a car identical to mine, down to the bumper sticker on the back window. It sat idling in the middle of the road a few hundred feet behind me, its headlights glaring like twin eyes in the darkness. And then, slowly, it began to move. I floored the gas pedal, the engine roaring as I sped down the highway. The other car followed, its headlights growing larger and brighter in the rearview mirror. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, my mind racing as I tried to think of a plan. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the darkness pressing in from all sides. No exits, no turns, no sign of escape. Just me, the highway, and the car behind me, its presence a constant reminder of how trapped I was. I glanced at the clock again, 9:45 p.m. The numbers glared back at me, unchanging, as if mocking my efforts to escape. My pulse raced as the car behind me gained speed, closing the distance between us with alarming ease. What do you want? I shouted, my voice breaking with desperation. Just leave me alone. But there was no response, no sign that the driver, or whatever was inside, had heard me. The car simply kept coming, its headlights like twin beacons of inevitability. And then, just as it was about to overtake me, it veered off the road. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching as I skidded to a stop. My heart pounded as I watched the other car disappear into the desert, its headlights cutting through the darkness like ghostly lanterns. For a moment, I thought it was over, but then the sound began. A low, guttural rumble, like the growl of a predator circling its prey. It seemed to come from all around me, filling the air with a sense of menace that made my skin crawl. I turned my headlights off, plunging myself into darkness. The growl grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was out there was getting closer. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I clutched the steering wheel, my knuckles white against the leather. And then I saw it. A figure, standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by the faint glow of the neon sign in the distance. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, its face obscured by shadows. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its gaze on me, heavy and unrelenting. My hands trembled as I reached for the gear shift, ready to turn the car around and drive as fast as I could in the opposite direction. But before I could move, the figure raised one long, bony arm and pointed back toward the rest stop. It was a command, not a suggestion. I didn't want to go back to the rest stop. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to floor the gas pedal, to leave the dark figure behind and drive until the wheels fell off. But as I stared into the void where the figure stood, its impossibly long arm still pointing toward the glowing sign in the distance, I knew I had no choice. The air around me felt suffocating, as if the figure's command carried a physical weight, pressing down on me. My heart pounded as I shifted the car into reverse, slowly backing away from the figure. Its silhouette never moved, never wavered, just remained frozen in place like a grim sentinel. The closer I got to the rest stop, the heavier the air seemed to grow. It wasn't just the oppressive sense of dread. It was something else, something almost alive. My ears buzzed, my vision blurred at the edges, and my mind felt like it was being stretched thin, teetering on the edge of some incomprehensible abyss. When I finally pulled into the parking lot, the neon sign buzzed louder than before, the hum vibrating through my chest like the growl of some unseen beast. I killed the engine and sat there, staring at the convenience store. The lights inside flickered sporadically, casting jagged shadows that danced across the empty aisles. I didn't want to go back in. Whatever answers Bill might have, I wasn't sure they were worth the price of stepping inside that building again. But the thought of staying outside, under the watchful gaze of the dark figure, was somehow worse. The bell above the door chimed as I entered, the sound echoing through the empty space. The air inside was thick and stale, carrying a faint metallic tang that made my stomach churn. Bill was behind the counter, just as I'd left him. But this time he wasn't reading a magazine or pretending not to notice me. He was staring directly at me, his eyes dark and inscrutable. "You came back," he said, his tone more a statement than a question. Did I have a choice? I shot back, my voice sharper than I intended. "What the hell is going on here, Bill? Why can't I leave? What is this place?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached under the counter and pulled out something I hadn't noticed before. An old ledger book, its leather cover cracked and worn with age. He placed it on the counter and opened it, flipping through pages filled with handwritten entries. "This," he said, tapping the open page, "is the record." I frowned, stepping closer to get a better look. The pages were filled with names, dates, and brief descriptions, some in neat cursive, others in messy scrawls. Some entries were marked with a red X, while others had strange symbols next to them that I couldn't decipher. "What kind of record?" I asked, though I already knew I wouldn't like the answer. "Everyone who's ever been here," Bill said, his voice low. "Every traveler who's taken that exit, stopped at this rest stop, and found themselves stuck." My eyes scanned the page, the names blurring together in my mind. Decades of entries, maybe more. I saw a name circled in bold ink, John T. Harris, 1972, and a shiver ran down my spine. "What happens to them?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Bill looked at me, his expression grave. "Some leave," he said simply. "Most don't." I felt the weight of his words settle over me like a heavy blanket. "And the ones who don't? What happens to them?" He hesitated, then closed the ledger with a soft thud. "They become part of the place." I didn't understand at first. Part of the place? What does that even mean? "You've seen them," he said quietly. "The figures, the shadows, the ones who can't leave. They're still here, watching, waiting. This place holds on to them." My stomach twisted as his words sank in. The thought of those shadowy figures, once people, now something else entirely, sent a cold wave of dread washing over me. "Why me?" I demanded. "Why am I here?" Bill didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned the ledger back to the page he'd shown me earlier and pointed to a blank line at the bottom. "Your name's not here yet," he said. "That means there's still a chance." "A chance for what?" I asked, my voice rising with desperation. "To leave? To escape?" He nodded slowly. "But it won't be easy." Bill reached under the counter again and pulled out a battered map, the kind you'd find in an old gas station, complete with creases and smudges from years of use. He unfolded it and laid it on the counter, revealing a detailed layout of the surrounding area. But something about the map was off, distorted, almost as if it were a crude sketch rather than an accurate representation. "This is your way out," he said, pointing to a faint red line that snaked through the map. "Follow this road, and it'll take you back to the highway." I frowned, studying the map. The red line twisted and turned, cutting through dense forests and open fields in a way that didn't match any road I'd seen on my drive in. "This doesn't make sense," I said. "There's no road like this out there." "There is," Bill said firmly. "You just can't see it yet." His words only added to my confusion. "What do you mean, I can't see it?" He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. "This place messes with your mind," he said. "It makes you see what it wants you to see. But if you follow this map, no matter what you think you're seeing, you'll find the way out." I didn't know whether to believe him, but what choice did I have? I couldn't stay here, couldn't let myself become another name in that ledger. "And what happens if I don't?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Bill didn't answer. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes said it all. I left the store clutching the map like it was a lifeline. The neon sign buzzed louder as I walked past it, its flickering light casting jagged shadows across the parking lot. I got back into my car, unfolded the map on the passenger seat, and took a deep breath. This is it, I muttered to myself. One way or another. The engine roared to life, and I pulled out of the parking lot, heading toward the faint red line on the map. The road stretched out before me, dark and endless, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I drove, the air grew heavier, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The headlights barely cut through the gloom, and the road seemed to twist and turn in ways that defied logic. I gripped the wheel tightly, my eyes darting between the map and the road ahead. And then I saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by the headlights. It didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, watching me. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. My heart pounded as I stared at the figure, its form shrouded in shadows. For a moment, we were locked in a silent standoff, the air between us thick with tension. Then, slowly, the figure raised its arm and pointed to the road ahead. I pressed the gas pedal slowly, inching the car forward. The figure in the middle of the road didn't move an inch. Its arm stayed raised, pointing toward the seemingly endless stretch of road ahead. My knuckles turned white as I gripped the steering wheel, unsure whether to drive past it or turn back. But then, where would I go? The rest stop? That neon-lit prison? No, there was no turning back. As the car rolled closer to the figure, the headlights illuminated its form more clearly. Its body was elongated, unnaturally thin, and shrouded in shadows that seemed to writhe and twist as if alive. Its face, or where its face should have been, was a void, an abyss that seemed to swallow the light. My heart pounded in my chest, and every instinct screamed at me to slam the car into reverse and floor it. But I didn't. Instead, I kept moving forward. When the car was just feet away from the figure, it suddenly stepped aside, melting into the shadows at the edge of the road. I let out a shaky breath, barely aware that I had been holding it. The figure was gone, but its presence lingered, an oppressive weight pressing down on me as I drove past. The road ahead was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It didn't feel real. The asphalt was cracked and uneven, with weeds sprouting through the fissures, and the lines marking the lanes were faded almost to the point of invisibility. The trees that lined the road were twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The further I drove, the more the landscape seemed to shift and distort, as though the world itself was unraveling. I glanced at the map on the passenger seat, its faded red line guiding me through the madness. It was the only thing keeping me grounded, the only thing that made any sense in this nightmare. The road twisted and turned in ways that defied logic, and more than once, I was sure I had driven in a circle. But every time I checked the map, it told me I was on the right path. The first hour felt like an eternity. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the crunch of gravel under the tires. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath fogging up the windshield. Then the whispers started. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the noise of the car. But as I drove further, they grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just one voice. It was many, overlapping and blending together in a dissonant chorus. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was unmistakable. Anger, fear, desperation. I turned up the radio in a futile attempt to drown them out, but the static that filled the speakers only added to the unease. The whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder, as though they were competing with the static, fighting to be heard. "Shut up," I muttered under my breath, my voice trembling. "Just shut up." The whispers didn't listen. The road grew narrower, the trees closing in on either side like a living tunnel. The headlights barely cut through the darkness now, and every shadow seemed to pulse with malevolence. My hands trembled on the wheel, my eyes darting between the road and the map. The red line was still there, leading me forward, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. And then I saw it, a sign on the side of the road. It was old and weathered, its paint peeling and faded. But the words were clear, "No exit." My stomach dropped. I slowed the car, staring at the sign in disbelief. Was it a warning? A cruel joke? Or something else entirely? The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel my grip on reality slipping. I pressed on. The next sign appeared less than a mile later. Turn back now. This one was different. It wasn't weathered like the first sign. It was pristine, as though it had just been placed there. The letters were stark white against a black background, and they seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. I didn't stop to question it. I couldn't. The road stretched on, and I was trapped on it, bound by some invisible force that wouldn't let me leave. The trees seemed to close in tighter, their branches scraping against the car like claws. The whispers turned into a cacophony, a deafening roar that filled my head and drowned out everything else. And then, just as suddenly as they started, they stopped. The silence was worse. I rounded a bend in the road and slammed on the brakes. The car skidded to a halt, the tires screeching against the cracked asphalt. My heart pounded as I stared at the scene before me. A figure stood in the middle of the road, just like before. But this one was different. It wasn't the same shadowy being that had pointed me down this cursed path. This one was human, or at least it looked human. It was a man, middle-aged, dressed in a tattered suit that looked decades out of place. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken and hollow. He raised a hand and waved, a slow, deliberate motion that sent chills down my spine. I didn't move. I couldn't. My hands were frozen on the wheel, my foot hovering over the gas pedal. The man took a step closer, then another, his movements stiff and unnatural. His lips moved, but no sound came out. And then he was gone. One moment he was there, and the next, he wasn't. The road ahead was empty, the only evidence of his presence a faint imprint of footprints in the dirt. My hands trembled as I gripped the wheel, my mind racing. What was he? Another victim of this place? Or something worse? I pressed on, the car creeping forward at a snail's pace. The map on the passenger seat seemed to pulse faintly, its red line glowing brighter as I moved closer to whatever was waiting for me at the end of this road. The landscape around me grew more distorted, the trees twisting into grotesque shapes, their branches reaching down like skeletal fingers. The air grew colder, and the hum of the engine was the only sound in the oppressive silence. And then I saw it. A structure loomed in the distance, its silhouette dark against the faint glow of the horizon. It was the rest stop. My breath caught in my throat as I realized where I was. I had followed the map, driven miles on an impossible road, only to end up back where I started.